The phone was pressed so tightly against her ear that Maya Whitfield could feel her own pulse in the plastic, and her voice dropped to a hiss as she paced the length of the linen closet, one hand braced against a shelf of folded towels that smelled like cedar and starch. I need a boyfriend by tomorrow, Renee. I am not walking into that wedding alone. Her older sister's laugh crackled through the line, tinny and unhelpful. You want me to just conjure a man out of thin air? It's Thursday night. I don't care how you do it. I need a date to Courtney's wedding tomorrow afternoon, or I am not going, and if I don't go, everyone in that church is going to say I couldn't stomach watching Terrence marry someone else. I would rather die than give them that satisfaction. She did not hear the footsteps in the hallway outside the closet door. She did not hear them because Jehun Kong did not make footsteps when he did not want to be heard, and he had stopped just past the doorway on his way to the study, close enough to catch every word through the gap where the door had not quite latched. Maya had worked in the Kong household for 6 months, hired through an agency that vetted domestic staff for wealthy families who value discretion above almost everything else, and in that time she had learned the particular geometry of this house. The room she was permitted in freely, and the room she was not, the hours when the halls filled with quiet, purposeful men who wore their jackets a half-size too large over what she suspected were holsters, and the specific stillness that entered every room the moment its owner walked into it. She had come to this job after a year of scraping by on temporary hostess shifts and one disastrous stretch waiting tables at a restaurant that closed without paying its final 2 weeks of wages, and she had learned, in that year, to stop asking too many questions about employers whose money seemed to arrive from nowhere in particular. The agency had been clear about the boundaries before she ever set foot on the estate. Do not ask about visitors. Do not ask about the men who came and went at strange hours. Do not repeat anything overheard in this house to anyone outside its walls. She had signed the agreement without hesitation, needing the paycheck more than she needed answers, and in 6 months, she had never once broken it. She had never once, in 6 months, said his name out loud where he could hear it, had never allowed herself the presumption of familiarity with a man who ran an empire that stretched from the Han River docks to warehouses on the outskirts of 3 different cities. But tonight, exhausted and humiliated by the mere thought of her ex-fiancé's wedding invitation sitting unopened on her dresser for 2 weeks, she had forgotten, for one unguarded moment, that sound traveled in this house exactly the way silence did. "Renee, I have to go," she whispered, hearing something shift in the hallway, a change in the air she could not name but felt instinctively, the way prey feels a shadow crossing overhead before it understands why. "I'll figure something out. I always do." She hung up and stood very still in the closet, heart hammering, and when she finally eased the door open and stepped into the hallway, Jehun Kong was standing there waiting for her, arms loose at his sides, dark eyes unreadable in the low light of the corridor. He was 36 years old, and wore his authority the way other men wore cologne, invisible until you were close enough to feel it settle over your skin. Tonight, he wore a charcoal suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, and a thin white scar traced along his jaw that she had never once asked about, because some questions in this house were understood to be off-limits without needing to be stated. His hair was dark and cut close, his shoulders set with a kind of stillness that came from a man who had learned, long ago, that stillness unsettled people far more than movement ever could. "I wasn't listening on purpose," he said, though his tone suggested he felt no particular need to apologize for it either way. Maya felt heat crawl up her neck, mortification tangled with something sharper, the specific humiliation of being caught mid-vulnerability by a man who had built his entire reputation on never showing any of his own. "It's fine," she said, though it was not fine, not remotely, and they both knew it. "I'll figure it out." He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her feel catalogued rather than seen, and then he said something that made the floor of the hallway seem to tilt beneath her feet. "I'll go with you." She blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "To the wedding. I'll go with you. You need a date." "I have nothing scheduled tomorrow afternoon." Maya opened her mouth and closed it again, searching for a version of this sentence that made sense inside the reality she understood, the reality in which she was staff, and he was the man who owned the house she cleaned, and there was no version of that sentence anywhere in reach. "You're offering to be my fake boyfriend for a wedding," she said slowly, as if saying it aloud might reveal the trick hidden somewhere inside it. I'm offering to accompany you so the people at that wedding stop making you feel small, he said. Whether that requires acting or not is up to you. That is not a normal thing for an employer to offer his housekeeper, she said. You work in a house full of things that are not normal, Miss Whitfield, he said, and for the first time since she had known him, something that was almost a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone again before she could be certain she had seen it at all. Consider it a professional favor. I dislike watching people underestimate someone who works under my roof. It reflects poorly on my judgment. It was not romantic, the way he said it, not soft or generous in any way she could point to directly, but there was something underneath the words that felt like it meant more than the words themselves, and she found herself nodding before she had fully decided to agree.
Fine, she said.
But you have to actually act like you like me.
Convincingly.
I have a very nosy family. I am extremely convincing when I need to be, he said, and this time the almost smile did not fully disappear, and she went to bed that night with her stomach in knots that had nothing to do with the wedding at all. She lay awake a long while replaying the exchange, turning it over the way she might turn over a coin looking for a counterfeit seam, and she could not find one. Whatever he had offered plainly, without the practiced smoothness of a man angling toward something he wanted from her later, and that plainness unsettled her more than charm would have. Charm she knew how to defend against. This, whatever this was, gave her nothing to push back on. The next morning arrived too fast and not fast enough, and Maya stood in front of her small mirror smoothing down a deep green dress she had bought 2 years ago for an occasion that never happened, wondering if it was possible to actually go through with this, to walk into a church on the arm of a man whose real profession she was not permitted to ask about, and pretend to a room full of people who had watched her heart get quietly, publicly broken, that she had landed on her feet. Spectacularly. Jehun was waiting for her in the front hall when she came downstairs, and the sight of him in a black suit with a single dark green tie, chosen, she suspected, to match her dress in a way that could not have been accidental, sent a jolt of something unfamiliar straight through her chest. You match me on purpose, she said. I pay attention, he said simply, as if that explained everything, and in his world, she was beginning to understand, it probably did. The drive to the church took 40 minutes, and somewhere around the halfway point Jehun reached over without asking and adjusted the strap of her dress where it had slipped from her shoulder, his fingers brushing her collarbone for half a second, brief and businesslike and entirely too warm for something so small, and neither of them said anything about it, though the silence that followed felt loud in a way silence had no business being. Rules, she said finally, staring straight ahead at the road. If anyone asks how we met, we say through mutual friends. Nothing about you employing me. If Terrence tries to talk to me, you get to look mildly threatening, but not actually threatening. And please, for the love of everything, do not tell anyone what you actually do for a living. Noted, he said, and there was a dry amusement in his voice that she was startled to realize she liked. What do I tell people you do, then? She asked. I have to have something ready. My Aunt Deborah interrogates everyone she meets within 4 minutes. Tell her I run an import and logistics firm, he said. It is not even untrue. It is aggressively not the whole truth, though, she said. Most useful things are, he said, and something in the flatness of his delivery made her laugh despite herself, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and he glanced sideways at her for just a moment before returning his eyes to the road, something unreadable passing over his face, too quickly for her to name it. The church was exactly as she remembered every church from her childhood being, cool stone and stained glass casting colored light across pews filling steadily with people she had once considered close friends, people who had, in the 18 months since her engagement collapsed, mostly disappeared into Terrence's orbit instead of hers. She felt every eye that turned toward her as she walked in on Jehun's arm, felt the particular electricity of gossip traveling silently through a room, and she straightened her spine and let him lead her to a pew near the back, his hand settling at the small of her back with a proprietary warmth that made her breath catch despite every rational argument she made against it. Her sister Renee found them within minutes, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and delight that Maya recognized instantly and dreaded. Who? Renee mouthed silently, staring at Jehun with undisguised interest. Later, Maya mouthed back, and Renee's grin only widened. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows Maya barely registered. Her attention split uncomfortably between the man at the altar who had once promised her forever, and the man beside her now who had promised her nothing at all beyond an afternoon of borrowed comfort. And yet somehow it was the second man's presence that steadied her, his shoulder solid against hers, his hand finding hers at some point during the vows and simply holding it, no explanation offered or required. It was during the reception, glasses of champagne circulating and a band tuning up in the corner of the ballroom, that Terrence finally approached, his new wife on his arm, his smile the particular brand of smug that Maya remembered too well from the last months of their relationship. "Maya," he said, looking her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "You look good. Didn't expect to see you here." "Wouldn't have missed it," she said, and felt Jaehoon's hand settle warm and deliberate against the small of her back again. A wordless anchor. "And who's this?" Terrence asked, extending a hand toward Jaehoon with the particular condescension of a man who assumed himself the most important person in every room he entered. "Jaehoon Kong," Jaehoon said, shaking his hand with a grip Maya suspected was harder than strictly necessary, given the brief flicker of discomfort that crossed Terrence's face. "Maya's told me a great deal about you." "All good things, I hope," Terrence said, recovering his smile. Jaehoon's expression did not change at all, but something in his voice, low and even, carried an edge sharp enough that Maya felt it in her own spine. He looked directly at Terrence and said nothing further, simply held the silence a beat too long, the kind of silence that men who ran rooms for a living knew exactly how to weaponize, and Terrence's confidence visibly cracked under the weight of it before he excused himself with considerably less swagger than he had arrived with. "That was terrifying," Maya whispered once he had gone, staring up at Jaehoon with something between horror and admiration. "He deserved considerably worse," Jaehoon said, and there was something in his voice, quiet and controlled and entirely too protective for a man who was supposedly only here as a favor, that made her chest tighten in a way she was not prepared for. Terrence's new wife found Maya alone near the dessert table 20 minutes later, and to Maya's genuine surprise the woman did not seem interested in gloating. She only studied Maya for a long moment and said, quietly, that she had heard some things about how Terrence had handled the end of his last relationship, and that she hoped Maya had landed somewhere good. Maya thought of Jaehoon standing several yards away, watching her with that same careful attention he seemed to give everything, and told the woman, honestly, that she thought she had. They danced once, near the end of the reception, his hand to her waist and hers resting against his chest, and she could feel the steady certainty of his heartbeat beneath her palm, could feel the particular way he held her, careful and deliberate, as if she were something valuable he had been trusted to carry without dropping. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said quietly, her cheek nearly resting against his shoulder. "I know," he said. "Then why did you?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice had dropped low enough that only she could hear it over the music. "Because in 6 months in that house, no one has ever once told me the truth the way you did, standing in a linen closet whispering to your sister at midnight. Everyone else in my life tells me what they think I want to hear. You didn't even know I was listening." The confession sat between them, unadorned and unmistakable, and Maya found she had no ready response for it, only the sudden, dizzying awareness that whatever this had started as, a favor between an employer and the woman who pressed his shirts, it had become something else entirely somewhere in the space of a single afternoon. They left the reception before the cake was cut, and the drive home was quieter than the drive there had been, comfortable in a way that surprised her, and when Jaehoon walked her to the door of the guest cottage where she stayed on the estate grounds, he paused at the threshold instead of simply leaving, his hand still loosely holding hers. "Thank you," she said. "For today. For all of it." "You're welcome," he said, and then, after a beat that stretched long enough to feel deliberate, he added, "I meant what I said in there." "I know," she said. He did not kiss her that night, though she thought, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him in the cool evening air, that he wanted to, and she understood without being told that a man like Jaehoon Kong did not take that step lightly, that whatever this was building toward would be earned slowly, deliberately, the way everything in his world was built. The following week unfolded strangely, softer around the edges than any week that had come before it. Jehun found reasons to be in rooms she was cleaning, asked her opinion on things that had nothing to do with her actual duties, lingered at the kitchen table over coffee longer than a man with an empire to run should have had time for. She told herself she was imagining the shift in him, and then she caught him watching her from across the study one evening with an expression so unguarded, so entirely unlike the controlled stillness he wore for the rest of the world, that she could no longer pretend she was imagining anything at all. One afternoon he asked her, apropos of nothing, what she had wanted to do before the restaurant closed and left her scrambling for work, and she told him, a little embarrassed at the admission, that she had once dreamed of opening a small catering business, nothing grand, just something that was entirely her own. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and at the end he said only that he did not doubt she would get there eventually, said it with such flat certainty that it landed harder than any grand compliment could have. It was on a Tuesday, 10 days after the wedding, that the quiet of the house shattered without warning. Maya was carrying a stack of folded linens down the east hallway when she heard raised voices from the study, sharp and urgent in a way that made every instinct in her body go still, and then a sound she would spend the rest of her life recognizing instantly, the particular crack of a gunshot fired inside a closed room, followed immediately by shouting and the heavy thud of running feet. She dropped the linens and ran toward the sound instead of away from it, some part of her brain screaming that this was foolish even as her legs carried her forward, and she reached the study doorway in time to see one of Jehun's own lieutenants, a man named Sungmin she had passed in the hallways dozens of times without a second thought, standing over Jehun with a gun raised. Jehun himself pressed back against the edge of his desk with blood already blooming dark across the sleeve of his shirt where a first shot had grazed him. Maya did not think. She would tell herself later that thinking would have gotten Jehun killed, that there had been no time for anything but instinct, and she grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from the side table nearest the door and hurled it with everything she had at Sungmin's head, the impact staggering him just enough that his second shot went wide, burying itself in the bookshelf instead of Jehun's chest. Jehun moved in the half-second the distraction bought him, closing the distance and driving Sungmin back against the wall with brutal, economical force, the fight that followed lasting only seconds, violent and precise, until Sungmin lay still on the study floor, and the room had gone terribly quiet except for the sound of both their ragged breathing. You could have died, Maya said, her voice shaking as she stared at the blood soaking through his sleeve. So could you, he said, crossing the room to her in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders as if he needed to confirm with his own hands that she was solid and unhurt and real. Why would you run toward that? Why would you run toward a gun? Because it was you, she said, and the honesty of it surprised her even as she said it, raw and unfiltered, and entirely too true to take back now. His men arrived moments later, taking Sungmin's unconscious body away, and in the chaos that followed, Jehun refused every offer of help for the wound at his shoulder, waving off his own men with a sharp word, insisting the bleeding had already slowed, and Maya understood without needing it explained that in this world, showing weakness even in recovery was its own kind of danger, and so she did not press him toward comfort he had no intention of accepting. Instead, she stayed close while his men secured a house and combed every room for anyone else who might have been working with Sungmin, and it was in the tense hour that followed, waiting for confirmation that the threat had been fully contained, that Jehun finally told her the truth about the wound underneath all his careful stillness. Sungmin's father served my own father for 20 years, he said, sitting now at the edge of the desk, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. When my father died, and I took control, I kept Sungmin close because loyalty was supposed to run in families. Because I trusted the shape of the relationship more than I questioned the man standing inside it. I did the same thing once before, years ago, with a woman I loved. Her name was Hannah. She worked for a rival family feeding me information I thought was helping me, and by the time I understood what she truly was, it had already cost me almost everything I had left to lose. I told myself I would never again let anyone that close. And then you stood in a hallway telling your sister the truth without knowing I could hear it, and I forgot every rule I had built around myself to survive. Maya listened to this with her chest aching, understanding now the full weight of what it had cost him to offer her that afternoon at the wedding, understanding that a man who had been betrayed twice by people closest to him had chosen, against every instinct built by that history, to open a door for her anyway. "I'm not her," Maya said quietly. "Whatever she did to you, I'm not her."
"I know," he said.
"That is precisely the problem. I have spent 6 months trying to convince myself that you are exactly like every other danger in my life, and every single day you prove me wrong." The days that followed carried a new tension neither of them tried very hard to name, and it was 3 nights later, in the quiet after the household had gone still, that Maya found him in the study again, standing at the window with his shoulders still stiff beneath a fresh shirt, staring out at the dark grounds with an expression she had learned, by now, to recognize as him wrestling with something he did not often allow himself to feel. "You should be resting," she said from the doorway. "I don't rest well," he said.
"Not lately."
"Not since a woman in a linen closet ruined my ability to pretend I don't need anyone." She crossed the room to him, and this time, when she reached him, there was no hesitation in either of them, no careful distance maintained for propriety's sake. His hand came up to her jaw, careful of the space between them, and when he finally kissed her it carried none of the calculated control she had come to expect from him, only something raw and searching, a man reaching for something he had convinced himself for years he did not deserve to want. The peace did not last. 2 days later, word arrived that the rival faction Sungmin had been working for, a splinter group angling to seize territory along the docks while Jehun's organization reeled from the betrayal within its own ranks, had grown bold enough to move directly, and the move they made was aimed squarely at Maya. She was walking back from the market 2 streets from the estate, a habit she had refused to give up despite Jehun's growing unease about her moving through the city alone, when a black sedan pulled alongside her and 2 men stepped out, their intentions unmistakable in the way they moved to box her against the wall of a narrow alley. Maya's training in this world was 6 months old and entirely improvised, but improvisation had kept her alive this long, and when the nearer man reached for her arm, she drove her keys hard into the side of his neck and used the half-second of his surprise to run, screaming for help in a crowded market street where witnesses made violence expensive. Jehun reached her within minutes, having been alerted the moment her expected route home deviated by more than 90 seconds, a security protocol she had not known existed until this instant, and the fury on his face when he found her, shaken but unhurt, in the doorway of a bakery where a stranger had pulled her inside for safety, was unlike anything she had seen from him before, controlled and lethal and entirely, unmistakably personal. "They're trying to reach me through you," he said, his hands framing her face, checking for injury with a desperation that betrayed exactly how much control he had lost in the minutes he thought she might be gone.
"This ends now. I want to help end it," she said.
"Absolutely not," he said. "This is not your fight." "It became my fight the moment they grabbed for my arm in that alley," she said. "I am not going to sit in that house and wait to find out if you come home. I have spent my whole life being the person things happen to. I am done being that person." He argued with her for the better part of an hour, and in the end it was not her stubbornness that won him over but her logic, cold and clear despite the fear still trembling beneath her composure. She had spent 6 months in that house learning its rhythms, learning which staff moved through which rooms and when, learning enough about the daily patterns of the estate to spot what did not belong, and it was Maya who noticed, 2 days later, that one of the newer kitchen staff hired during the chaos of Sungmin's betrayal had been asking careful, casual questions about Jehun's schedule that no legitimate new hire had any reason to ask. She brought the concern to Jehun quietly, without fanfare, and the information proved to be the thread that unraveled the entire plot, a planted informant feeding the rival faction real-time details of Jehun's movements in preparation for a strike planned for the following week, timed to coincide with a meeting he held every month with suppliers along the river docks, a meeting where his security was traditionally lighter than anywhere else in his territory. They let the informant believe her information was still being used, feeding her false details about the following week's meeting while Jehun's real security quietly repositioned around the docks 3 days early, and when the rival faction strike team arrived expecting an unprepared target, they found instead a trap sprung with brutal precision. Maya was not present for the confrontation itself, kept safely at the estate at Jehun's absolute insistence, but she waited through the longest hours of her life for word, pacing the same hallway where all of this had begun with a whispered phone call, until finally his car came up the long drive and he stepped out unharmed, the threat that had hunted them both finally, completely ended. He crossed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms without a word, and she felt the tension leave his body by degrees, felt him breathe her in, as if confirming, over and over, that she was real and whole and still there. "It's over," he said finally, his voice rough against her hair. "All of it. The docks, Sungmin's people, the whole rotten branch of it, cut away." "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, drawing back just far enough to look at her properly, "I stopped pretending I only wanted a favor returned. I stopped pretending that afternoon at the wedding was about anything other than not being able to stand the thought of anyone else standing beside you." She laughed despite the exhaustion of the last week, despite everything they had both survived to reach this moment, and there was something startlingly light in the sound, the release of a tension that had been building since the night he first stood outside a linen closet listening to a truth she never meant for him to hear. "I believe congratulations are in order," she said. "You're an excellent fake boyfriend. 10 out of 10. Highly convincing." "I wasn't acting," he said, and the honesty in it, plain and unguarded, was somehow more disarming than anything dramatic he could have said instead.
"I know," she said.
"I wasn't either." He kissed her then, slow and certain, in the same hallway where she had once whispered a desperate confession into a phone, never meaning for him to hear it, and this time there was nothing accidental about the moment at all, only two people who had survived enough danger together to know exactly what they were choosing, and exactly what it might still cost them. In the weeks that followed, the household began to shift around the two of them in small, unspoken ways, the staff no longer startled to find Jehun lingering in rooms with no obvious reason to be there, Renee calling twice a week now instead of once a month, delighted beyond words at how thoroughly her sister's fake wedding date had become entirely, permanently real. Maya kept her job and name only, though what she actually did in that house had shifted into something far less easily defined, part confidant, part strategist, entirely essential to a man who had spent 2 decades convincing himself that trust was a luxury he could not afford. Renee visited the estate for the first time in early autumn, and Maya watched her older sister take in the quiet grandeur of the place with wide, undisguised curiosity, watched her corner Jehun near the kitchen and demand, with the particular bluntness only an older sister could get away with, whether his intentions toward Maya were serious. Jehun had answered without a trace of hesitation, telling Renee plainly that he intended to spend a very long time proving exactly how serious he was, and Renee had reported back to Maya later that evening, still faintly stunned, that she had never in her life seen a man answer a question like that without flinching. She never did figure out exactly when the fear of losing him quieted into something steadier, something that felt less like danger and more like home, but she remembered clearly the evening months later when he found her in the garden at dusk, no crisis pressing at either of their backs for the first time in longer than she could recall. And he took her hand without any explanation needed and told her that whatever else his world required of him, this, whatever it was they had built together, was the one thing he intended to protect above everything else he owned. She thought, standing there with the last of the summer light fading gold across the garden and his hand steady around hers, of the woman she had been 10 months earlier, whispering a desperate lie into a phone in a linen closet, terrified of walking into a room alone, and she understood now that she had never truly needed a boyfriend for that wedding at all. She had needed, without knowing it, exactly the man who had been listening on the other side of the door the whole time, patient and quiet, waiting for a truth he had not expected anyone in his world to ever hand him freely. If this story had you holding your breath from that very first whispered phone call, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more dark romance stories just like it. Drop a comment below telling me which moment hit you hardest, and let me know what story you would like to see told next. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.